Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Harris, and I am pleased to welcome you on behalf of the National High School Center to this webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars on Tuesdays in June that focus on a variety of issues and practices related to college and career readiness in the topical areas listed on your screen. And you may register for any of these webinars if you have not already done so using the screen that appears on your screen. After a brief introduction and overview, we will hear a presentation on today's topic by Dr. David Conley, our featured speaker, followed by a Q&A session with a sample of questions submitted during the registration process and during today's broadcast. This will be followed by a brief demonstration of the National High School Center's new College and Career Readiness Community of Practice that we are unveiling and inviting you to join today. Before we begin, though, I would like to share a few housekeeping items. As Debbie indicated, this entire conference call will be muted so to improve the quality of the recording and to eliminate any background noise. If you wish to submit a question during the webinar to Dr. Conley or any of the other presenters, you may do so by typing it into the Q&A box that you should see at the located to the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Likewise, if you have any difficulties or questions related to the technical aspects of this presentation, you can use the chat box that's located above the Q&A box. So let's go ahead and begin. The National High School Center is part of a large network of stakeholders who are dedicated to maximizing the post-secondary attainment of all high school students. As a federally funded TA Content Center, we work with the regional comprehensive centers who in turn provide support to states, districts, and schools. We also collaborate with the Office of Special Education Programs, TA and Dissemination Centers, and the IES Regional Educational Labs, as well as the myriad of for-profit and nonprofit TA and service providers and other stakeholders who are engaged in college and career readiness work at multiple levels. During the past few years, we have been closely examining the college and career readiness and post-secondary transitions work of these various stakeholders and practitioners, and have seen several challenges emerge along the way. First, there are many variations on how to define college and career readiness and few concrete ways to measure it, especially beyond the Common Core state standards. Second, the traditional organization and cultures of many high schools, as they are currently structured, may create barriers for ensuring that all students graduate college and career ready. And third, there are a wide range of targeted services, resources, and initiatives that are taking place under the broad umbrella of college and career readiness with only limited alignment among these initiatives. For example, we recently took a closer look at the focus, research, and resources of 70-plus organizations that describe their work as part of the CCR landscape. Not surprisingly, the references to college and career readiness frequently came from very different and sometimes competing perspectives. Nevertheless, there are commonalities that exist and are demonstrated throughout this word cloud that was derived from the 10 most common definitions that are currently in use by these organizations. As a result of our work, we have developed a college and career development organizer to map these various TA and resource development initiatives and hopefully to help others traverse this confusing terrain. Our organizer consists of 3 intertwining strands. Goals and expectations for college and career readiness addresses the question of what high school graduates should know and be able to do. Initiatives in this strand go beyond the Common Core to pathways content standards, college and career knowledge, and lifelong learning skills. Many of the 4 keys that Dr. Conley will be sharing today are grounded in this strand. Pathways and supports for college and career preparation cover the myriad of initiatives and help students meet these goals and expectations through personalized learning supports and rigorous programs of study, as well as the many types of internal and external supports and structures that all must be aligned to help all students succeed. The third strand, outcomes and measures for college and career success, includes all of the activities and initiatives that focus on using data to monitor student on-track progress and provide certification of mastery, as well as feedback for high school improvement. More info on the organizer and these and other related resources briefs can be found on the link provided on the screen. College and career readiness is not a new educational trend, despite the recent popularity of the term. Fortunately, there are researchers who over the past decade have been addressing the challenges of actualizing college and career readiness for all students, and Dr. David Connolly stands out as one of the most nationally renowned experts in this field. The National High School Center is pleased to collaborate with him and his colleagues at EPIC on some new CCR resources we will be sharing later this summer and fall. And I am pleased to introduce this presentation on the complexity of college and career readiness. David?
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with all of you this afternoon, and particularly to my West Coast colleagues, please go ahead and feel free to eat while I'm talking. Don't stop on my behalf. It's certainly intruding on your lunch hour. For the rest of you throughout the country, thank you for taking the time in your busy schedule for this what I think is really an important topic for us to be considering right now for a variety of reasons. What I'm going to do is spend about 45 minutes, I think, going through some of the main points on why college and career readiness is a complex construct, why we have to think about it across multiple dimensions, and how we've thought about it in perhaps too simple or simplistic of a fashion up until now, what the effects are of having done that, and then give some thought to what all of this means for practice for the specifics of what we all ought to be doing. What I won't be doing is inventorying particular tools or techniques or methods that are available commercially. That's beyond the scope of this discussion, but I will be trying to suggest strategies that are pretty general and that should provide you sufficient guidance to really think about how to get going, more on addressing some of these issues within the context of your school district, your classroom, perhaps even your own family. So the place where I'd like to start is just a bit of an overview about the current policy environment in which we exist. We sometimes forget that this whole notion of college and career readiness for essentially all students is a relatively recent development. We, as a nation and as a school system, national school system, state school system, local schools, have always thought about college as something that was for one group of students and career, which really meant work, as being for some other group of students. And we haven't really thought about college or a high school diploma really as being something that prepares all students for a life beyond high school. We've thought about it as kind of a culminating achievement. Here we are, we're coming up right now, and a lot of graduations have been going on, and all the celebrations, the people walking across the stages, it's really quite invigorating. I spent 20 years as a public school administrator, and it was really the high point of the year. But we really have to ask ourselves, what is it that these students are getting? What does it really mean to walk across that stage and get that diploma? What are they really capable of doing beyond high school? That's the nature of college and career readiness. It's what can they do to continue their education, to continue their transition from high school into a life in a world beyond high school. What we see is a lot of attention given to this concept right now for a variety of reasons. Many of you are probably aware that states are looking at waivers from No Child Left Behind, and in the waiver process, they're being asked to identify college and career readiness standards that they would adopt that their states would commit to. As the discussion drags on about reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which No Child Left Behind is a part, the notion of college and career readiness has been elevated in those discussions, and to the point where if the act is reauthorized, one of the possible new names for it would be the College and Career Readiness Act. We're seeing a lot of state-level activity. You're probably noticing this in your own states as well. Discussion about how to get more students ready for college. In some states, it amounts to having all students take an admissions test, the SAT or the ACT. In other states, it might be an advanced placement initiative where students schools and students are reimbursed for the cost of an AP exam. In other states, it may be an emphasis on dual credit, dual enrollment programs. And in others, it may simply be looking at the college-going rates and trying to see what which groups are succeeding in getting onto college and which groups are not, and why. So we see a lot of activity going on in states. We see a particular emphasis on reducing remediation rates in post-secondary education, and how do we have high schools that prepare more students so that we have less remediation. And of course, spanning over all of this are the Common Core state standards and the assessments that are being developed by two groups of states, the Smarter Balanced Consortium and the PARC, which is a Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. And in both of those sets of assessments, their purpose is to measure the Common Core state standards and ideally to measure them in a way that provides insight into the readiness for college and careers of the students who take those exams and who have learned the Common Core state standards. Finally, I think it's worth noting somewhat parenthetically here, because it's not something we can do something about directly, but there's an increasing pressure for students to be able to succeed in college because of the amount of debt that they're taking on. It used to be that the model in the U.S. was very much that you would go on to college, whether you knew what you were doing or not, and I'd ask you to sit, as you're listening here today, reflect on your own preparation for college and the degree to which you really were ready and you knew what you were doing and you had a path all planned out and you went there that first day of that first year and you knew what college was going to be for you. The U.S. model has been that people go to college to figure out what they want to do. But that has involved a lot of kind of swirling and changing directions and moving from institution to institution, and in many cases it's included also dropping out of college, sometimes to drop back in and other times not. In the process, students collect now increasing large amounts of debt, and that debt becomes a hindrance to their future economically, and it forces them to make certain choices about employment. So what we're seeing is a lot more attention given by states to having students move through post-secondary education more quickly because they're not really going to be able to lower the tuition rates very much. That really argues for students who are better prepared to succeed in college. All of these factors lead us to say, how do we get more and more students to where they're able to be prepared when they go into college to be able to succeed? And the economic and social factors that say that throughout their working lifetimes, today's generation will likely need a set of skills that is developed post-high school, suggests that if the students who are not exposed to or have that opportunity to continue to learn beyond high school are going to have a challenge throughout their lives because they will not be as adaptive. They won't be able to cope with changes in the economy or changes in society, changes in technology, and so forth. We've created a world where, whether we believe that every person needs a college degree to get a job or not, we've created a world in which change is the new constant and where adaptability throughout one's lifetime is the new skill that every student needs. So how can we make sure that all of our students have that set of capabilities that allow them to keep adapting throughout their lifetime successfully? And one of the ways to do that is to prepare them for learning beyond high school. So when we talk about college and career readiness, we need to be clear about what it means. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, gets operationalized a lot of ways. Joe mentioned that they pull terms from a lot of different definitions. I've had a definition for quite some time. I'll share that with you later. But one of the things that we want to note is that increasingly we're seeing the adoption of college and career readiness standards and assessments, most specifically in the form of the Common Core. And the assumption has been that these standards will, in and of themselves, drive the changes that we need so that more students are ready for post-secondary learning. Well, I'd like to suggest that while the standards and assessments are incredibly useful and valuable, they are not the whole story, and that college and career readiness, as it says on the slide, is more than a single score on an English and a math test. And I think we understand that intellectually, but it's a real easy trap to fall into, to say, well, college and career readiness is a very complex thing. We've got this test here that measures a lot of things, so it must be a pretty good measure of college and career readiness. Or we say, well, it explains about a quarter of the variance that we see in the grades that students get in their first classes as freshmen. Or we have some other measure that leads us to believe that it's a good enough explanation of what it takes to be ready for college. Well, it's not a bad measure. It's just not sufficient. And I think as we talk about more students being ready for college, and as we talk about more students succeeding in college, and we talk about more students not taking on extra debt by being able to move through college efficiently and effectively, then we realized that we've got to have more information and a broader definition of readiness than just an English score and a math score on a test, no matter how good that test is. Finally, when we think about college readiness and career readiness, there's been a temptation to say, well, you need a set of good skills. You need to be able to read and write, and you need to be able to do some math and everything, and you need that for careers, and you need that for college, so college readiness and career readiness are the same. Well, we actually kind of tested out that assumption, and we went and analyzed the content of entry-level courses and of entry-level type of career positions, and we reached the conclusion that while there's a lot of similarity, they're not exactly the same. It shouldn't be, though, taken to mean that we have separate tracks for students, but it does mean that we need to think carefully and long and hard about exactly what skills are needed to go on to a post-secondary environment, particularly that leads to a 4-year degree versus going into a career-oriented program at a 2-year institution. I'll try to break that down for you in more detail as we go along. So, okay, if we think about, hold on, I think we just jumped a slide here, sorry. So we face a gap in student aspiration. Basically, we've been successful in getting students to understand that they need to learn beyond high school. And if you ask sort of a typical 9th grader, what are you going to do after high school, they will just sort of, without thinking about it much, say, well, I want to go to college. Now, that's not really a strong commitment to what it takes to be ready for college, but it's an improvement over saying, I don't know what I'm going to do, or saying, I don't really want to even, I would just don't want anything to do with schooling. I mean, the idea that there's a commitment to learn beyond high school is a good thing, even though it's not really very deep or focused. And the reason that this is important is that if the most that we can expect out of students in terms of their performance is that level to which they aspire to perform. And if they don't aspire to perform at a level that is sufficient to go on and learn beyond high school, they're not likely to perform at a level that's necessary to get them prepared to do so. So what we're saying is that the aspirations are important. However, students then don't necessarily act consistent with their aspirations. And I think a lot of you who are educators probably know that students say they want to be this, that, or the other thing as far as a career, or they want to go on to college, and yet they don't take the right classes, they don't do their homework, their friends don't value academic performance necessarily, a whole series of factors that make it very difficult for them to achieve their aspirations. So what we end up with is a gap between what kids say they want to do and what they end up doing. And sometimes it's a function of the kids, sometimes it's a function of the opportunity they have in schools, but it's more often a combination of the two. And the students who are most likely to have the largest gap are the students who are from groups that are underrepresented in post-secondary education, kids who would be first in family to attend college. They are the ones who are most likely to get lost along the way. They're the ones who are most likely to get the wrong advice from peers or others. They're the ones who are most likely to make a mistake in not filling out a form or not getting something completed on time. They're the most likely to have the least information about the options they have available to them around financial aid and other things. And so the result is they tend to underperform relative to aspirations. So if we think about aspirations then as a group of 100 middle school students and say, what are their aspirations? Well, we know from numerous surveys that in this case, 93% say they want to go on to college. Now, that's 7% who say they don't already, but nevertheless, that's a very high number, and that number shows up, something in that range shows up for pretty much every survey that I've seen that's out there, and regardless of the group of students, interesting enough. EPIC has an instrument of its own that it uses and that we've given to over 20,000 students, largely in inner city schools, and we have a figure that's close to this as well as far as the number. Well, if we go to the end of high school now, we see that of that original 100, 70 have graduated from high school. So between 9th grade and 12th grade, we've lost 22%. So they're, not to say they can't go on to college in the U.S., it's a double, we do have a second chance system, but it's going to be much harder for that group. So already we have an aspiration gap starting to take shape. Now, from that 70 who graduate from high school, 44 go on and enroll immediately in college. Now, others will come back and enroll later. Some go into the work world and come back. Others go into the military and then re-enroll. So that number is, in fact, it's not to say that no one ever goes beyond high school into college if they don't enroll right out of high school. However, it becomes harder and harder to do. So that's a pretty big drop-off, 37% drop-off from the previous group. And now we're up to 66 of our original 100 who are not, I'm sorry, 56 of our original 100 who are not any longer on the road to college, at least as directly. Finally, if we go to the proportion of this cohort that graduates within 6 years, and you notice we don't use a 4-year figure because in the overall national statistics is about 33% in graduate in 4 years. It's about 50% in state schools, and it gets up into the 70% range in private schools as an average. But we'll see that only 26 now of our original 100 have earned that degree within 6 years, and that's a 41% drop from the number that enrolled. So what we have is a constant fall off in the proportion of students who are moving through to this higher level, keep consistent with their aspirations. And one of the things that we really want to be thinking about is how do we help a larger proportion of students achieve their aspirations and keep moving through that pipeline successfully to learn beyond high school. So in today's talk, I try to pull from a variety of sources, including a couple of publications I've had, and a recent article in Ed Leadership you might be interested in on college and career readiness, same or different. And I also should just like to make people aware that I'm also a first in family to go to college, and that shapes my perspective. I grew up in California, and at a time when in a high school where not very many people went on to college, and I was sort of my family wanted me to go, and they wanted me to aspire, and I was one of those kids who you asked me in ninth grade, what are you going to do? I said, go to college, and if you saw what I did through high school, I did not do a lot of the things that one would do to make that happen. The morning I was supposed to take the SAT, somebody forgot, so I'll take the ownership here. The alarm didn't get set. I didn't wake up. 5 to 9, I wake up, and the test is already well underway, so I just went back to sleep, and that was the end of the SAT. Graduated from high school and without enrolling in a college, and then it became to be the fall, and I thought, well, maybe I better do something here. So I go to the local community college. The day classes start, and I try to enroll there and get a class. And, of course, you can imagine my selection by waiting that long. I mean, I was fortunate in that I did get enrolled into the Associate of Arts transfer program in California and ended up 2 years later transferring to the University of California, Berkeley, and spending 4 years. I also took 6 years to graduate from college. I was lucky. I was lucky that a lot of things came into play for me, but I was not very purposive. I was not very intentional in my actions, and I certainly was not very efficient in the way I went about it. So I understand it at a personal level, and I certainly see it a lot in the young people that I've worked with. I spent 20 years working in public education. I saw a lot of young people who I thought had tremendous potential, who just were getting derailed for the wrong reasons. They just were not making the right decisions, and they didn't realize the implications of a lot of their actions. A lot of what we tell students now, and a lot of the way we look at it, I think, is based on an eligibility model far more than a readiness model. In other words, what we do is tell people, sign up for the right courses, take the right tests, get the right letters of recommendation, and you go on to college. And if it were that easy, we wouldn't have a problem. But we have so much variation in what a college prep course is, so much variation in the kind of scores students have to get on tests to go into college, and so much variation even on the way we place students. In California, the 100 and some community colleges, they have 90-some different placement methods. So we have no one real clear level of what it means to be eligible for college. What we really have is what I call a hunting license model. I'm on the faculty at the University of Oregon, and I get a parking permit, which does not give me the right to park my car. It gives me the right to drive around and see if I can find a parking space in which to park my car. And in a way, we're admitting students to college under that same model, which is it's no guarantee that they can succeed, the fact that we've admitted them. We don't know if they're ready or not, but we'll let them try. And a lot of times in many cases, we've used entry-level courses as our true admissions criteria, and those entry-level college courses have been the place where we've determined if students have the actual knowledge and skills, which seems terribly unfair and certainly a little too late to find out midway through your college course that you're lacking seriously in many of the skills you need to succeed in college. And we'll talk about what those skills are, because I think if we tell students what those are earlier, they're going to be more inclined to develop them. If they know what's expected of them, they're more likely to respond. If we can focus on making them ready, not just eligible, I think we'll get a much better result. So my definition as of a college and career-ready student is someone who possesses content, knowledge, skills, and habits necessary to be successful in post-secondary education at a level that will lead to a family-sustaining career. And not every student needs exactly the same proficiency, and their interests influence the precise knowledge and skills necessary to be ready for post-secondary studies. But I will just kind of show you some examples here of the kind of things that we look for in students who are ready. And keep in mind that many students who are eligible for college cannot do many of these things. Proficiency, not just with literature, but also with a range of informational texts. And informational texts require some very specific reading strategies that often are underdeveloped. Writing shouldn't be limited to narrative or just opinion-based writing, but we need really well-developed skills in expository and descriptive writing as well. So there's a number of modes that are more important in college. They get underdeveloped in high school because no one teaches them very systematically. The quantitative skills in algebra and geometry are important, but what is increasingly important is the ability to understand and interpret data, which is whether that's a mathematics skill per se. I don't need to debate really, but it's something that's not taught all that specifically, because it's not just probability and statistics. It's being able to interpret charts, graphs, tables, data arrays. It's being able to draw a conclusion from quantitative information and see what's reasonable and what's not. And it's a skill that's increasingly important in all of the social sciences as well as the physical sciences and other areas. Knowing something about the scientific method and how information is organized in the sciences, you don't have to know every detail about everything in every science, but you do need to understand something about how science works. And the bigger ideas in the key areas of science. Something about how social systems operate, and I include history in that as a way to understand how social systems operate and how they're studied. Going into college classes, if you have this general disciplinary knowledge and awareness, particularly of how they're studied and how they're organized, it gives the student a leg up in that entry-level type of course. Proficiency in a second language, and then experience and appreciation of creative and expressive arts. All of these lead to readiness for college and careers, and I want to keep coming back to the career piece in a little more detail when I talk about some of the key learning techniques and strategies that layer upon this content knowledge. But for the career areas, the informational texts are incredibly important. The writing is incredibly important. The quantitative literacy, as I describe it. And then depending on which type of an area in which you have an interest in terms of your career goals, some of the others come into play as well. So let's talk then for a moment about the Common Core standards, because I did have the opportunity to work on them a bit. I co-chaired the validation committee at the national level that took a look at the standards and tried to see if they really measured up to the claims that they were making. What I try to capture in this slide is the notion that the college and career readiness, the standards themselves, although they're aligned to college and career readiness, they're not entirely clear on what they are claiming themselves as being a measure of in relationship to college and career readiness. So the English language, arts, and literacy standards basically talk about the fact that students who master the standards are prepared to enter college and workforce training programs ready to succeed. Sort of a modest level of claim. The mathematics standards, interestingly enough, don't make any claim relative to college and career readiness, except that students will be able to access the knowledge and skills necessary in their post-school lives, which I actually think is a reasonable focal point to say that if you can keep learning beyond high school, that's a key skill to have. But just to note that the Common Core State Standards are not explicit, even though they have a college and career readiness level to them, and at which they conclude, they don't say specifically what they claim students are going to be able to know and be able to do as a result of mastering the standards. So I think we need to keep looking at the standards a little more deeply. I'm going to do that in a few minutes here as well. We did do a study of the Common Core State Standards. I'm going to summarize that very extensive study for you very quickly here. The standards we found to be applicable and important to success in a wide range of post-secondary courses at a cognitive level that's sufficient relative to college, and covering knowledge that's necessary for success in college, not omitting key skills, and having a core of knowledge and skills that is common across general education and career courses. However, we note career areas tend to have knowledge profiles that differ from general education because we looked at both general ed and more career-oriented courses. So the next few slides summarize what I just told you. They just in the summary slide, they're going to give you just a bit more detail. So we had instructors from about 2,000 entry-level college courses submit information about their courses and then review the standards for us. And you'll see these are the content areas where we looked: English language arts, mathematics, science, social sciences, and then the more career-oriented business management, computer technology, and healthcare, and spread across these areas. And what we found here for English language arts and literacy, if we take a look at the lighter, the sort of olive-colored bar, that's our English language arts respondents, and we see that they gave those are instructors who are in the English language arts area. They gave very high marks to the standards for reading for literature, reading for informational text, writing, and so forth. The dark green bars, so over on the right-hand side, get more at the respondents who are not English language arts instructors, and you'll see that reading for history and social science, reading for science and technical subjects, and writing for history, social sciences, and technical subjects, that the writing received the highest marks there. So you can see that there's some variation in terms of where the standards track in these areas, but if you'll notice that in the middle, the two bars, speaking and listening and language, highly rated by the ELA respondents, also highly rated by all the rest of the respondents. Speaking and listening and language are 21st century skills that we tend to undervalue in our assessment processes because they're more difficult to measure. Our assessments, even the new common core assessments, are going to focus not on speaking and listening and language, but on the writing, which is important, and the reading, which is also important. But you can see here that instructors emphasize the importance of speaking, listening, and language, and we don't want to overlook that part of the standards. Mathematics, the olive-colored bar here is our math instructors, and the darker green bar are all the respondents as a group. And you'll notice that the math instructors give a lot of importance to number and quantity and algebra, functions, geometry. Statistics and probability less so, geometry less so. And you'll notice that our other instructors, which remember include English and all other areas, so it's kind of more of a mixture. You see number and quantity is important, algebra is important, functions a little less so, geometry not so much. Statistics and probability is almost as important to the non-mathematics respondents as to the mathematics respondents. But if you take a look at the next bar, mathematical practices, you'll see that 100% of the math respondents and 73% of the other respondents, including respondents from English, history, social sciences, say that those math practice standards, those 8 statements that talk about problem solving, that talk about thinking mathematically, that talk about using mathematical models, that talk about technology and technological applications of mathematics, those are rated very, very highly. Once again, much more difficult to assess. And I know the consortia assessments are going to attempt to measure these things. But let's keep our eyes open and let's listen carefully as we learn more about these assessments to see how well they assess mathematical practices, which perhaps are better measured within the context of the mathematics classes themselves, or maybe in the application of mathematics to other subject areas, which in fact is probably the most important use of mathematics, not just to make students into mathematicians, but to make them into users of mathematics. The ability to apply mathematics in other subject areas is very important across the spectrum in post-secondary education, in career and college-oriented learning settings. Well, very quickly then, as far as the cognitive demand of these courses, were they sufficient for students to be prepared to succeed? Overwhelmingly, the instructors said yes. And were the English standards a coherent representation of necessary knowledge? Now, this was, in fact, all the respondents here, and so this includes math, computer science instructors, and everyone else. And of this, you can see that nearly 84% said that the English standards were a coherent representation of knowledge that's necessary to succeed in entry-level college courses. The math standards, once again, all the respondents, including non-mathematicians in it, and so a little higher proportion saying no, and that's partly a function of the fact that the math standards were not as necessary in some of the courses, but still a high proportion, 62%, saying that the mathematics standards represent the knowledge that's necessary to succeed in college courses. So an endorsement for the Common Core State Standards as a measure of college career readiness, but with some caveats and some perhaps paying a bit more attention in some of the areas that we may not be looking at as carefully in our assessments, but that will be important in the instructional programs. So that I would note next here that the National Assessment Governing Board, which is a group that is responsible for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is our nation's report card, a national test of performance within the U.S., educational performance, is currently studying their version of readiness, which they call preparedness. It's a subset of readiness in their mind. And they note, at least here, that readiness includes behavioral aspects of student performance, such as time management, persistence, interpersonal skills, that go beyond a reading, writing, math test. So NAEP, to its credit, they've come up with this distinction between preparedness and readiness to say our test does not test everything, and we're not claiming that it does. It tests a subset. So let's think about readiness then as a comprehensive, multidimensional construct. And if we start with these different levels of readiness, I think it also helps us to understand what it is we want to expect of all students. So work ready is this ability to meet basic employer expectations and to start a job. And when you ask employers about what does it take for someone to be work ready, you get a sort of a depressingly low level of expectation. I mean, can they show up on time? Can they not be on drugs? Can they not be fighting with their fellow workers? Can they follow some directions? And, sort of the reason I say it's depressing is an awful lot of people don't meet that standard. They don't meet the work-ready standard. So, yes, I mean, we need to have schools in which students learn how to behave properly and get themselves prepared to operate in a work environment, but that's not enough. The next level, job ready, is the ability to learn the specific knowledge necessary to begin an entry-level job. So it means to be able to be trained. Now, in some cases, training is following directions. In other cases, it's mimicking or observing someone else. But in many, many cases, job training is actually relatively sophisticated, and it can require its own set of activities that the employer conducts. So I'm not talking about training programs outside of the workplace. I'm talking about within the workplace as job ready. So already we're seeing some skills here that you need to have. That the speaking and listening I mentioned becomes increasingly important in this environment. But we're still not to a level that I think we're really calling kind of college and career ready. The next level starts to approach that, and we call it pathway ready. And that's when you can not just learn the skills for one job, but you have a solid enough foundation that you can be learning and preparing yourself for a study or an area that will have a career pathway associated with it. So now you're not just learning the job, but now you're getting ready for a career. And whether that's entering into the medical field as a technician or environmental engineer or entering into starting your own business as an entrepreneur or starting off in any sort of a program that has some career pathway potential to it, there's a stronger level of academic knowledge and skill that you need and a stronger level of these learning techniques and strategies that I'm going to talk about in a minute that's also required. So the next level, then, the post-secondary ready, is where you're going to be able to deal with specific, basically college types of courses, and it's a lot of what we thought about before, and it's a broader range of academic content knowledge and certainly a broader range of thinking skills. And additionally, it's a set of cognitive strategies that you also need in that pathway-ready area. It's ways to think about learning and to engage in the learning process cognitively, not just procedurally by following directions, but at a higher level of engagement cognitively. And then finally, we don't want to overlook the level of ready for a career and life, that all of these lead to the ability to pursue that career pathway, but also have a fulfilling life as a productive citizen. We don't want to become so focused on a set of knowledge and skills that we forget that all of this is within the context of educating the whole person for a life beyond high school. So those are our levels of readiness. And this is our comprehensive model. This is probably the most important single slide out of the whole presentation. It's the notion that college and career readiness has 4 important keys to it, 4 components. And you'll notice here just very quickly, key cognitive strategies, key content knowledge, key learning skills and techniques, key transition knowledge and skills. And you notice that the content knowledge is kind of second in a sense as we go clockwise around the circle, beginning with the cognitive strategies. And the reason why, the content knowledge and the cognitive strategies are closely interconnected, but it's not enough just to know something. You've got to be able to do something with what you know. You've got to be able to use that information. So the way we think of this then, to make it just a bit simpler, is when we talk about the cognitive strategies, we say you have to know how to think. When we talk about the content knowledge, we have to say, well, you have to know something because you have to think about something. When we talk about the key learning skills and techniques, we say, well, you have to be able to act. You have to be able to actively engage in your own learning. And when we talk about those transition knowledge and skills, we say, you've got to then be ready to go on to college. So the model we reduced to 4 action verbs: think, know, act, go. Cognitive strategies, content knowledge, learning skills, transition knowledge. And I'll just very briefly give you a bit more information about each of those. All right, so the cognitive strategies, to give you an idea of what they consist of, it includes, basically this is an element of kind of an inquiry cycle, but it applies across multiple different learning settings and situations. We derive this from analysis of what the kinds of things that students are asked to do in entry-level college courses across a very, very wide range of courses. So formulating a problem is very challenging, particularly for high school students who are used to being given problems all the time. Then collecting information through the research process before they begin to write, so that you've got something substantive to write about, not just your own opinion, or not just the first thing you run across in an internet search, because we all know that search is not the same as research, but I think a lot of young people have kind of lost sight of that notion. Just plugging a word into a search engine is not the same thing as carefully collating a set of information that helps you to answer your question that responds to that hypothesis that you formulated or that thesis statement that you formulated previously. Once you've got that, you've got your hypothesis, your focal point that you're trying to investigate. You've collected information. Third thing then is you've got to interpret what you've found before you start to do that next stage, which is communicate it. Now, a lot of young people I know from my own teaching and my own 3 daughters would rather skip over the first 3 steps and to get right to the 4th step. I'm required to write a 5-page paper, so the very first step I want to do is start writing because my focus is on producing the product. It's not on the process of thinking that sets up then the ability to write that product. It's I want to write the paper because I need to turn it in. And I've seen kids writing papers in the weirdest situations, under the weirdest circumstances because they just had to get it written. But when you get to college, when you're in the work, when you're in a career-oriented training program or a complex learning environment, the kinds of skills you need are the ability to formulate a problem because it's rarely given to you with all of its components. You need to collect some information almost always. Things are just not that simple that you can just do them without investigating. And you need to give some thought to what the solution to the problem is before you then proceed to whatever form of communication you're going to use. So in our inquiry cycle, you can see here that in each one of these stages, then, students are taught specifically how to do these things. They develop the skills so that they have a range of strategies for thinking in more complex ways. Throughout it all, they need to be precise and accurate. They can't just be random. They can't be making numerous mistakes and overlooking them and not paying any attention to those. We may tolerate that in a high school environment, but much less tolerable in college and certainly in the work world. So an example of a task that would require key cognitive strategies is this one. Students study natural disasters, then choose one and write a policy paper or an annotated outline for a policy paper for the Conference on World Disaster Reduction. The paper, or it could be an oral presentation, it could be an individual piece or a group piece. The paper itself has to predict reasons humans are affected by natural disasters. That's that hypothesizing function, right? Problem formulation. They have to research a type of natural disaster. That's that researching piece I was talking to you about. They have to have an outline of how to mitigate the impact of this type of disaster. That gets you into the interpretation part. And then they have to discuss the trade-offs associated with different policies that might mitigate the impact. and that gets you into the communication part. So you can see here I've kind of laid it out in more detail. We don't normally lay it out in this much detail for students, but this is what a task would look like that would cause you to develop those key cognitive strategies. The content knowledge itself, we can certainly take the Common Core state standards and say, yes, those make up our key content knowledge. But there's a structure of knowledge that the Common Core gets at, and it hints at, but it doesn't really lay it out explicitly. And that structure of knowledge has facts, key terms, but it also has linking ideas and organizing concepts. And we can't forget that there's a higher level of abstraction when you think about content knowledge. So in mathematics, understanding about equations and inequalities and functions, understanding about ratio and proportion, these are more organizing concepts. What we don't do a great job of is pointing out to students that those are organizing concepts or linking them together. In reading, in strategic reading, there's a lot of concepts. So like comprehension, if you're reading along and you've gone 4 or 5 pages and then all of a sudden realize you don't remember anything from the last 4 or 5 pages, the best response is not to say, wow, gee, I'm making really good time here. The best response is to say, I need to go back and highlight some of the areas that are important because I clearly missed them. So understanding some larger organizing concepts and ideas within the subject areas is important here. We also want to think about how students relate to content knowledge. To what do they attribute their success or lack of success? Is it effort or is it aptitude? Is the material valuable to them and is it challenging? These are the key things that the research tells us will help students to engage in content if they attribute their success to effort, not to aptitude. In other words, I do well because I try hard, not, gee, I'm just not good at this, so there's no sense trying. Something that they have a reason to value it and that they view as challenging. One of our real problems is that we under-challenge students, and we particularly under-challenge our lower performing and our special needs students. And it's very, very frustrating for these young people, and it's one of the reasons they get bored and one of the reasons they leave school, is it's just not engaging enough. And it doesn't have to be sort of relevant to their daily lives. It can be just interesting. It can be engaging. It can be something where they can't do it simply. It's not a worksheet. It's not a one-step problem. It may be something that takes them a little time to do. Now, they can be frustrated by that at first, but it's the kind of thing that they learn to appreciate as something they're getting out of school, a reason they're there. It's developing these key learning skills, knowing who you are, knowing how to set goals, being motivated, persisting with difficult tasks, monitoring your own performance, asking for help when you need it, and then showing self-efficacy so you control the things you can control. And, of course, these are things that we find low-achieving students are much less likely to do than high-achieving students. So there's no mystery here. But what's the mystery is why we don't teach everyone to do these things, why we don't explicitly expect our instructional processes, our curriculum, to teach students to develop these skills. As it is now, part of the achievement gap comes from the fact that some young people know how to be learners and others don't. And there's specific techniques. You can manage your time, take notes, study for a test, memorize, read strategically, learn collaboratively, use technology. And even though technology only shows up in this one box, it's another one of those skills that I think is sort of transcendently important and that the Common Core kind of mentions but does not really call out at quite the level that it needs to be called out. Our young people are going to be expected not just to use technology but to think in ways that basically learning becomes a process that's extended via technology. And we've got to really be integrating those skills, not just how do you use a keyboard, but how do you use technology to extend your thinking. So those are just a set of examples. And then we finally come to this key transition knowledge and skills. And if you notice, there's a lot of boxes with a lot of different things here saying it's tough to make the transition from high school to college. It's particularly challenging in the U.S. We may not be number one on every content measure in the world, but boy, when it comes to the complexity of transitioning from high school to college, we're number one. We've created a system that has many, many pitfalls and many places where students can fall off of that road to post-secondary participation. So many things that they can miss a deadline, they can not make a good decision about an institution. They generally don't know about financial aid until 11th grade. And our lowest income students are the last to find out about financial aid. This is what the research tells us anyway. They should be the first to find out. Students don't make good choices on programs. They sign up for colleges for no good reason. They get there, it doesn't fit. They go to the community college. They pick a program based on when a class is offered, not what's any interests they have. they don't know enough about themselves to make good choices, and they don't know really how to handle that post-secondary environment, how it's different from high school. So this type of information needs to be dispensed starting in middle school and then reinforced consistently throughout high school. It has to be doled out slowly because young people really don't want to confront the reality. They're going to go on to a life beyond their parents' warm and cozy home in many cases. In other cases, kids are already out in the streets fending for themselves and don't see college as that relevant. So, or possible. They don't even see it as a possibility. So we've got to help them to get this measured type of a progression towards making that transition, because it's not just a procedural undertaking of applying to college. It is a change in their role and their identity. And they need role models who show them how to do this. And they need to be able to handle that conflict and role, particularly if they're from first-generation families. It can be very threatening when that child is leaving the home, going on to a higher level of education than the parent. I mean, it takes a lot of courage by a parent to accept that a child might be more highly educated than that parent is. That process of supporting families in supporting children is something that has to occur on an ongoing basis, really from middle school on. It can't be accomplished just with the occasional college night or financial aid night. Some of this information needs to get built into the parent-teacher process. Some of it needs to be just communication that goes out. Some of it needs to be assignments that students are doing. For example, doing a research project on financial aid and the cost of college while they're in 9th or 10th grade. Working with some of the online resources that are available to help students investigate careers and the career options, and there are numerous programs. ONET is probably, it's O and then it's a asterisk, NET. It's a U.S. Department of Labor site that has more information about jobs and careers than anywhere. It has it in more detail, and they're developing more and more tools off of that site to help people explore it. But there are others. There are other sites and other tools available. But that exploration needs to begin much younger, be more guided and supported so that students are ready and eager to make a transition from high school to college. All right, so those are the 4 keys. But let's think a little bit then about what a career pathway would look like and what the entry-level skill requirements are. This is just showing how the convergence between the skills one needs for technical training and the skill and knowledge one needs for a bachelor's degree. This is an ONET example, what's called a Zone 3 jobs. They arrange the jobs from Zone 1 through Zone 5. And Zone 3 is the level at which you're starting to see some technical education be required. This one is an environmental engineer example, and as you can see, the kinds of things an environmental engineer does: they conduct pollution surveys, perform statistical analyses, review technical documents, provide support and planning, and so forth. The types of necessary skills shouldn't be any surprise: critical thinking, reading, judgment, decision-making, complex problem-solving, quality control analysis. And you can see that some of those line up pretty well with our key cognitive strategies. And we see here that this leads to degrees and certificate pathways, not just a bachelor's degree, but an associate degree and a certificate, which is then a lower requirement than an associate. So even to get a certificate level in this area, an area with a lot of future employment possibilities, you need a solid academic base and a solid set of cognitive strategies and learning skills and techniques. So how do we get all students to college and career ready? We only get there if we think of readiness as a continuum, not as a cut point. So if we think of student A, and we say, if we look at them along, if you remember our levels of readiness from work to job to career to college to life, and then we say, how are they doing on the key cognitive strategies, the key content knowledge, the key learning techniques and strategies, and the key transition knowledge and skills? Those are the 4 boxes across the top. We could fill out a profile for each student and kind of see how ready they were. Now, in this hypothetical student, we say, well, at the work-ready level, they've got everything except the transition knowledge and skills. At the job-ready level, yeah, they've got it all. If we go to the career-ready, they really don't have the cognitive strategies that worked out that well. And if we go to the college-ready level, they don't have the cognitive strategies or the learning techniques and strategy. So we'd say this student is approaching readiness. They could give career-ready level programs a shot. They would have a more difficult time with college-ready programs, but they're going to have a hard time in general because across the board, they're not showing readiness to make the transition. The profile gives us a lot more insight that is not apparent if we just take a test score, because this student in this example would have had the content knowledge scores as meeting all of those levels, and yet in some of these other areas we find they're not ready. So this is the profile notion. I've got a few minutes worth of just kind of closing observations here. While English and math content standards are necessary, they may not be fully sufficient, and that's a point I made a few times here. I've talked about speaking and listening, technology, cognitive strategies, learning skills and techniques, and that transition knowledge. So there's a lot more to it than just that English and math piece. So we do need to incorporate more than math and English in our expectations for college readiness, and I've laid out what we need to have here in some detail: the cognitive strategies, the learning skills, and then the process of transitioning from high school to college. All right, so an example from the Common Core standards is read closely to, this is one of the anchor standards in ELA, anchor standard 1, read closely to determine what the text says explicitly and to make logical inferences from it. Cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. Well, just as a parenthetical observation, if you look carefully, this is not one standard. It's at least two. They've used a semicolon here to kind of, shoehorn two standards into one, but we'll let that pass for the time being. The question I'd ask then, if we talk about a readiness level in this standard, what does competence in this standard look like? To be able to read closely to determine what the text says, to make logical inferences, to cite specific evidence from that's drawn from the text. What would competence look like? What would competence look like for different types of texts? How would you assess competence of the type I just described? And what would competence look like across different grade levels? I think we have to engage the standards at this depth, and not just do these alignment studies that we're doing where we say, oh, yeah, well, we do logical inferences, so that means we're aligned with the Common Core. I think we've got to go deeper and really say, what does this amount to as far as demonstrable behavior? What does it amount to in terms of the assessment methods we're going to use for that? No single test can gauge all of what's necessary, and the cut score approach. Cut scores are appropriate at the highest levels of aggregation, like at a national level or a state level, to say, like ACT does. They say, well, 75% of the students don't meet all of our benchmark scores on English, math, and science, so we say that they're not ready for college, and we say only 25% are ready for college. Well, that's fine. That's a cut score at a national level. What if we use that for admitting students to college? Well, only 25% of students would get into college. We'd be turning away far more than we are now today. But we propose to use these cut scores now at a more local level. So the more weight you put on one single score, in this case, a cut score, the greater the likelihood is that you're going to have a misclassification error. You're going to classify somebody wrong. You're going to say somebody's not eligible to succeed when they are, or they're eligible to succeed when they're not. We've got to begin to think about a wider range of information. And at the very least, I think, for high school grading practices, we've got to pull more writing in. We've got to pull more demonstrations of knowledge and skill, more presentations, more oral, more listening and following direction types of exercises. We need a wider range, more technology-based projects, a richer array, more of those kind of cognitive strategy tasks like that one on the disaster avoidance problem that I showed you earlier. This starts to get at this wider range. And even if all we're doing is just incorporating it into classroom grades, that's still, students are at least getting a grade will be a better representation of readiness than it is now. I mean, our grades have really slid to the point where over the past 30 years, they've increased so much that today's B is yesterday's C. I mean, what used to be a C in the early 1980s is now a B. Statistically speaking, that's the proportion. The distribution has moved almost a whole grade point in terms of the average. So we need to reestablish kind of the integrity of a grade and the types of activities that go into it. We don't have to mark students down. I'm just saying we have to make sure that the substance is there. We've got to be ready to look at some different types of measures. We've got to be able to be ready to think about attitudinal measures and self-reports. Now, you can't use it for high stakes, but getting a sense of students' aspirations and ambitions and tracking that from 6th grade through 12th grade will tell us who's falling off of the cart of that group of students that we looked at in those previous slides. Where are we losing students, and who are we losing? Whose ambitions and aspirations are changing? Which students aren't engaged, and why? We need to understand more of that, and the students need to put that together in more of a profile to see how what responsibility they're taking. Because at the heart of this, student ownership of learning in partnership with their families becomes much more important, particularly for students who historically have not seen themselves as being material for going on to post-secondary education. Our counselors alone can't do it. Our teachers alone can't do it. We've got to get more self-reports, more interest inventories, more thinking about future goals. Goal setting is incredibly important. I didn't really spend much time on it here, but getting students to have short-term, medium-term, long-term goals and be gauging their behavior against the goals. I think for states, we do need more measures of college and career readiness in school that would include more of these kind of expository essays that students do. Maybe they're graded at the school level, it's fine, but we need to have some more evidence that kind of writing is going on. We need to know the proportion of students applying to college and what kind of colleges they're applying to. We need to see what the success rate is in college and based on the high school that they came from, and understand where we can improve that. Not how do we punish people, but how do we improve it. We need to be looking at measures that provide some insight into the types of activities we've provided students. I mean, have we given them the financial aid information? Have we given them the information on signing up for college and so forth? What opportunities have they had around those transition skills? So a lot of the information we could be reporting is really information about opportunity to learn some of this as well, because the school's responsibility is to put it out there, and knowing the state's responsibility is to know that has occurred. In other areas, we need to go deeper, and I've suggested some of those around the cognitive strategies and the type of activities that yield those types of outcomes. But I think part of this has to be done in partnership with post-secondary institutions as well. So then, continuing on this notion of assessments, given the complexity, we should be thinking about not assessment system, but a system of assessment, not just one test. Grades, student self-reports, complex curriculum-embedded performance tasks, behavioral assessments, non-content-based measures. We should be moving toward profiles of individual students in relationship to their goals, and then constant recommendations on how to improve readiness. I know we talk a lot about formative feedback, but a lot of times that formative feedback is just how to do better on your next math test. Well, that's eventually we're testing more and more about less and less. Readiness for college is more and more about more and more. Students need to know more and more about more and more aspects of their knowledge and skill as they move towards being ready for college and careers. And we've heard a lot of talk lately about badge systems, the idea that you can acquire specific competencies or skills in areas and then get recognized for that at the time, and I think that's a great idea, rather than one overall big measure that says you're ready for college or you're not. You know, how do you do on the cognitive strategies? How do you do on your transition skills and knowledge? And, you know, how do you do on your learning skills and techniques? We can come up with badges in specific areas. Are you really good at, have you really learned how to do goal setting? We should give you a badge for that. We should acknowledge it. I'll tell you what, all the weight loss programs have learned the importance of recognizing achievement on the spot and accomplishments in small increments and measures and not waiting for some overall goal. Reinforcing the behavior right away, getting the students to see that they're being successful in some areas, even if they're not successful in all areas. So what are some of the things we can do here? We can monitor their aspirations more closely. I've said this a couple times. Are all students aspiring to ambitious futures? It doesn't all have to be a college, but it has to be some kind of a plan beyond high school. Does the curriculum have the full range of the Common Core, not just a narrow set of standards aligned to some hypothetical test? Are students reading challenging informational texts and reading them strategically? Are they engaging in those speaking and listening standards that I talked about that are so important in the world beyond high school? And are the standards for mathematical practice being integrated broadly into the curriculum and not just given a lip service? Are the assessment methods complex, multidimensional? Do we have performances and demonstrations, simulations, projects, presentations, team exercises, and critiques, all of which show up in college increasingly? Yes, some big entry-level courses have a lot of sort of simplistic assessment methods, but even in those courses, we're seeing increasingly breakout sessions where the students have to do performances or give presentations or have projects. If you look at the National Survey of Student Engagement, which looks at post-secondary students, you'll see a much greater increase in student engagement in projects and activities and presentations. And then we have to have students really develop profiles of their readiness so they know where they stand in relation to their goals at all times. Just a kind of a closing thought here. One thing that's highly overlooked and not that expensive is the high school and middle school syllabus. Right now, they're a tremendously underdeveloped tool that could be used to connect, not only to help students understand what the expectations are for them, but to help families to understand what the expectations are for their children. Right now, syllabi can be just a list of activities and due dates and little more, but we know that college syllabi and high-quality syllabi in general look at the alignment of courses to key standards, talk about the challenge level and expectations of the course, show how the course relates to specific futures, and generally to success in school beyond that course. And it also shows you how it connects with previous and subsequent courses. It creates a sense of real meaning for the student. And if the teacher makes the syllabus a living document and really brings it into the class and talks about it in the context of the class, the student keeps remembering why they're doing what they're doing. It can have a really positive effect. Also, the process of creating syllabi can have faculty talk to one another, both at the high school level and between high school and college, about what they're covering, how challenging it is, how it aligns, how it's sequenced, and get them to really see what they're expecting from students. Well, I went just a few minutes past the hour, but we still have plenty of time left for questions, and I'm going to turn this, I believe, back over to Joe to begin the questioning process.
Thanks, David. I want to encourage people, if you have additional questions you want to ask, just type them into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner. Even if we don't get to them today, we'll try to answer them through the community of practice that we're going to be talking about briefly. But David, while you were speaking, one question that did come in was, where can participants find the study that you were referencing in terms of the difference between college readiness versus career readiness?
Well, the study of the Common Core State Standards that I was referencing is on the EPIC website, which is epiconline.org, and then you may have to go to click on one of the tabs there, I think, for projects or reports. I think it's reports, and you should be able to get it from there.
Great. So let's look at some of the questions that came in during the registration process. First of all, are the Common Core State Standards, in your opinion, preparing students for a liberal arts education as readily as for a career in STEM?
Yeah, well, the STEM is pretty strong in there, particularly in the math standards. And if you look at, they've got an additional kind of supplementary set of standards with little asterisks by them that go beyond that. But I would say this. Increasingly, to prepare for a STEM career, you've got to really prepare in the liberal arts as well. So that's the first observation I'd offer, is that one of the real challenges we have is engineers who can't communicate well. Companies are having to hire specific people to help facilitate engineers talking to one another and to talking to the non-engineers, because most product development now is occurring with teams of people doing it. So I don't think we should be considering this bifurcation between people going into engineering careers and people going into the liberal arts. I think in the liberal arts, increasingly you need mathematics. You need understanding of number systems in areas that never was the case before. But I mean, if it's economics, even areas like archaeology, and sociology use quantitative analytic methods to an increasingly substantial degree. So I would say that we can make a strong case that proficiency in the Common Core prepares students for a variety of different futures and not for one over the other.
Great. So how do you propose assessing the other key elements of readiness, such as cognitive skills, learning techniques, et cetera?
Yeah, and I made a few suggestions there very briefly in a couple of those slides. But without getting into talking about specific instruments, because I don't think we really have time for that. I'm not sure it's really appropriate either. But I would say this, that what I'm seeing is a tremendous amount of development activity by a wide range of groups. For example, much higher quality performance tasks. Foundations have invested a lot of money in this. I'm seeing a lot more attention to what people have called non-cognitive assessments. In other words, measures of I like to call them non-content based, because I think they're still measures of cognitive skills. But I'm seeing far more development work going on in these measures of non-content-based areas, and I'm seeing new tools coming online really yearly in this area. We do a lot of work in this area as well. So I'm very hopeful that we've kind of reached the limit of 20th century psychometric measures, and that we'll continue to use those because they're valid. But now we're going to add on the 21st century measures that are going to take us far beyond what the 20th century measures could do for us. And I'm, as I say, I'm very heartened to know that a lot of different organizations are working in this space.
So what is the relationship between content preparation and 21st century skills?
Oh, that was a nice lead-in, wasn't it? So I think people tend to make a dichotomy, sort of a dichotomous relationship. They say, well, either you know something or you think about something. We either have to teach you something so you know it, or we have to teach you how to think. Well, in fact, most of the research from brain and cognitive sciences that I'm familiar with, at least, suggests that you think about something. You don't think in the abstract. So teaching kids thinking skills or group skills or any other process, intellectual process, cognitive process, in the absence of its application is probably not effective. So you don't want to really have a problem-solving curriculum. What you want to do is have problem-solving built into the content areas. You want to have group and collaborative activities built into challenging assignments across the content areas. So we want to embed those 21st century skills into challenging content, and there seems to be a lot of evidence that that's the way to go, and increasingly that seems to be the kind of curriculum and programs that I see being developed, or ones that integrate it. Now that means we have to be ready to handle more complex assessment within classes and not have the only way we test content knowledge be just a simple multiple choice test. We've got to be ready to have more complex measures. But given that, we can get at the integration of the cognitively more complex 21st century skills into the content areas.
So what key performance indicators have states build or should states build into their accountability systems to measure college and career readiness outcomes for schools and districts?
Well, it's a really good question, and the answer is a little bit kind of depressing in that states haven't done a good job in coming up with other measures yet. They have kind of stayed with a couple tried and true measures. They've looked at test scores or on their state exams, or they've looked at admissions test scores, or going just a little bit beyond that, they've started to look at the enrollment rates, which students are going to, and I mentioned that earlier in one of the slides, that I think that's a measure we can add. But there's a lot more things we can look at. There's a lot more information we can start to take into place, and even for accountability purposes, one of the things I mentioned in the talk was that we can hold schools accountable for giving students the opportunity to learn certain things, and providing a lot of that knowledge about key transition skills is something, and key transition knowledge and skills is an example of an area. Did all students get that chance to build their own profile? And did all students get the chance to connect with a mentor? And did all students learn about financial aid and learn about the choices available in post-secondary education? And so some of that, I think, can reasonably be an accountability measure. I don't think we should hold schools accountable for student success in entry-level college courses, but I think we should take a look at what the trend is. Is the trend improving, or is the trend going down? We should at least look at what it doesn't have to be an NCLB measure where we say everybody, every high school has to have every student go to college and be successful, but we should at least say, what's the trend line? Are more students applying to college from this high school? Are more students going on to success? And then, of course, what you're going to see is colleges are going to be held accountable now too, because this will only work if it's both sides of the street. We can't hold the high schools accountable without holding the colleges accountable. Now, I think the good news, depending on your point of view here, is that I think states are increasingly willing to hold colleges accountable for some level of student readiness and success. So there's a potential partnership here that can develop between the two systems. And I think not everything has to get built into the accountability system if we can build strong partnerships between high schools and colleges.
Key scores or PSAT or other similar scores, what data should be monitored from middle school to ensure students are on track for college and career readiness?
So middle school is interesting because you can't really, I know some vendors take instruments and just kind of roll them down into middle school, and they get a prediction function out of, and that's great. But a lot of times, what you're really getting is an artifact of students' economic backgrounds. When you're getting a test score in middle school that shows us they're going on to college, a lot of times you're measuring the parents' wherewithal rather than anything about the student. But I think we've got to start measuring in middle school whether students are setting goals for themselves. Middle school is an incredibly important time to start in that self-discovery process. It's when people are trying on identities and seeing who they are as people, And if we don't get them thinking, developing those higher aspirations while they're in middle school, we're going to have a problem. I think you can also be looking at the cognitive strategies, and you really should. That students should be we use a novice expert continuum, and what we say is that students at the middle school level should be what we call emerging novices, and by early high school they ought to be emerging strategic thinkers, and by the end of high school they ought to be strategic thinkers. We know almost nothing about students' cognitive strategies, capabilities in school right now. And if we knew something about that in middle school, we could build these more longitudinal models that let us see how students progressed from high school to college, from middle school to high school in terms of their development of these cognitive strategies, which after all take a longer time to develop. If you're not practicing the cognitive strategies early on, you can't do it in your last year or two of high school.
So one last question. In addressing the adult basic education system, how can GED teachers shift to preparing students for persistence and success in post-secondary endeavors?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. GED has always been an important alternative route to the high school diploma, and what we're seeing now is a major undertaking to redesign the GED itself. So I would say the first thing you ought to do is really pay attention to what the redesign of the GED is going to look like. And if we redesign the GED in a way that it really becomes not just a measure of kind of a minimal set of high school skills, but it really gets at some of these thinking strategies and some of these work-ready skills and career-ready skills that we talked about, then I think the GED instructor really has a broader challenge than just getting a kid to engage in a workbook of GED test prep. I think it really is how does the student think about their goals for their career, and what skills does the student need to be ready for that career? It goes back to that profile notion a little bit. It's not just the GED; it's the GED in relationship to the student's goals. What do they intend to do next in life? And the score itself, while, it's great to get the high school diploma, you want to make sure that it's consistent with a training program that they're going to enter, or a bachelor's or an associate program that they aspire to, or even a work-based training environment that has certain expectations as far as their skills. But I think we've got to make sure that the GED, and particularly the new GED, help students connect up realistically with what they aspire to and what they plan to do after they receive that high school diploma, that GED diploma.
Well, there's so many questions and so little time, unfortunately, David, and thank you for your thoughtful presentation and your response to some of these questions. We will, for those of you that have submitted questions that we haven't been able to address, we will work with David and the EPIC team to try to get as many of those answers posted on our new college and career readiness community of practice that we're rolling out today. So to quickly give you a walkthrough of how to access this new community of practice, I want to introduce Dr. Helen Duffy, who is the College and Career Readiness Coordinator for the National High School Center. Helen?
Thank you, Joe. So I'm just going to take a few minutes right now to introduce and give a quick overview of the National High School Center's community of practice. Acknowledging that there's a great deal of expertise and promising practices emerging in the field, we've launched this community today. It's an interactive online community that we hope will provide a platform where we can share resources and learn together as we participate in live chats and asynchronous discussion boards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to access the community of practice. There are a couple of ways to do that. One is to type this URL into your browser, which will take you to this landing page. Another option is to go to www.betterhighschools.org. You'll find a link to the communities of practice on the right-hand side of our homepage. So we'd like to invite you to join the community of practice and continue the conversation that we've sort of kicked off today with Dr. Conley's presentation. And this page will be the sign-in page for all of the Center's community of practices. So if you're new to the National High School Center's community of practices, what you would want to do is, all right, so if you're already a member of the High School Center's community of practice, what you want to do is just log in using your username and password. Once you're logged in, you can scroll down the page and find this graphic. Click on that and the join button, and it'll take you right to our college and career readiness page. If you're new to the High School Center's community of practices pages, what you'll need to do is sign in to join, and you'll fill out the information that appears in the box on the right-hand side with your name, your affinity group, and a username and your email. You should receive an email with your password within about 10 minutes of completing this request. If you don't, there are two things you can do. One, you can check your spam folder in case the email went to your spam folder. If it's not there, please contact us at nhsccommunity@air.org, and we'll get right back to you to assist you with the login. So once you're into the community of practice, you can scroll down to find a number of features. Drawing from some of the questions that you submitted when registering for these webinars, we've begun several discussion threads that you can access either through the read and comment buttons or through the, on the right-hand side of the page, you'll see recent content. You can click on the recent contact and find information or find those discussion threads listed there. To explore other topics of interest linked to our organizer, you can click on the read and comment button and explore some of the resources that are posted on our community. You can start your own discussion question, and we are hoping that we'll have a fruitful conversation from which we'll all learn. So we invite you to join and look forward to ongoing conversation. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Helen. So in closing, I want to quickly again remind everybody that this is the first in a series of 4 webinars. The next one will be held next Tuesday at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, lunchtime on the Pacific Coast, as David has reminded us, and that the topic of that one will be on linked learning, followed the following week by a webinar on college and career readiness and students with disabilities, and then culminating the series in a look at aligning resources and structures for supporting college and career readiness. So we invite you to participate in one or more of those webinars as well. We also encourage you to join the community of practice. And as I mentioned, we will be posting some of the additional responses to your questions through that community. You will be able to get a copy of this, download a copy of this, recorded copy of this webinar beginning on Thursday on our website. There's also a YouTube version at the site that's at the link that's listed that includes a closed caption version for those that were asking about a transcript for this presentation. Again, I want to thank Dr. David Conley. It's always, for me, an interesting, I love to work on webinars with him because I always find him to bring a new perspective, even when we've talked about the particular topic several times. His thinking is always involving and always evolving in a good way. And so I want to thank you, David, and look forward to continued opportunities to work with you in the future as well. And I want to thank all of you participants for your interest in this topic, and again, hopefully we'll be seeing you in the upcoming weeks and through the community of practice. David, before we sign off, I want to give you one last opportunity if there's anything you want to say.
No, Joe, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it, really enjoyed it. So good luck to you, your group, and to all of our listeners today.
And again, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place.